Here's a little bit of history that explains it. You see, the way we read the Bible changed radically in the 4th century. Up to the 4th century, the first 3 centuries of church history, when early Christians thought about God, they thought about this. This is a painting that comes much later, but it reflects the picture of God. God is most definitively, most decisively, the God who was crucified for us and for all people. God is the humble God, the meek God, the God who would rather be slain by enemies rather than slay his enemies. That's the heart of God. That's how they thought about God. And they understood, as all of us must, that the most fundamental job of a Jesus disciple is to imitate that love to all people at all times. They understood that. They were a persecuted minority in the Roman world, and so they just lived this countercultural, beautiful lifestyle of outrageous love. They got slaughtered all over the place, but they didn't mind, because they knew that this life was just a little prelude to the real thing, and that's how the church grew. Something terrible happened in the beginning of the 4th century. In 312, the Emperor Constantine allegedly got a vision. And the vision told him to put the first 2 letters of Christ on the shields of his soldiers, and he'd march into battle against this other rival emperor, and he would get the victory. See, this is how pagans think. Throughout history, they thought, the God who kills the most people is the greatest God. And so he was getting a revelation that the God of the Christians is the greatest God. How? How do you know that? Well, because he's going to help me kill people. That's just how it works in paganism. And Constantine's a good pagan, so he gets this vision. He thinks it's of God. Personally, I think it was of the devil if the vision happened at all. It may just be one big legend. And he goes into battle and he wins. So the next year, he legalizes Christianity. It had been illegal to be a Christian up to that point. He legalizes it. And then he begins to throw money at the Christians. And he begins to throw power at the Christians. He begins to throw pagan temples at the Christians, saying, you get to have your own temples. That's when we started calling a building a church. When in the New Testament, the people are the church, not a building. But see, Christianity becomes overnight paganized. In the Gospels, when Jesus is offered all the power of the kingdoms and all the glory of the kingdoms, Jesus and the Gospel authors see it as a temptation of the devil, because it's going to detract from our looking like Calvary, doing things a Calvary way. So it's a temptation of the devil. Now the same offer is on the table by the same being. But instead of seeing it as a temptation, people like Augustine and Eusebius and other church fathers say, oh, God is blessing us with the power of the sword, the power to run things. And why not? Because we're the superior righteous people. So Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire in 382. And in 383, we read about the first Christian mob storming a pagan temple and murdering the pagan priest. Things have radically changed. When you pick up the sword, you put down the cross. And then we find this image of Jesus. This is an icon around 500 AD. Now this is what Jesus looks like. Quite a stretch from the crucified Jesus. This is Jesus, and he's wearing the emperor's garments. He's a Caesar. And now they begin to see Jesus as this cosmic Caesar. And all the stuff about imitating Jesus and living the Calvary lifestyle, that all gets explained away, kind of gets filtered out. We thought that we'd have to imitate Jesus in his death, but turns out, no, we can, you jump right to the resurrection, and now we're going to rule the world. And now Christians begin to pick up the sword, and they think it's their job to conquer in Jesus' name. It's just like pagans have been doing throughout history, only now we're doing it in Jesus' name. You see, once violence got into their heart and their lifestyle, well, it colored their perception. We make God after our own image, if we're not careful. We read the Bible after our own image. We read our country after our own image. We read history after our own image. So now Jesus looks a whole lot more like, well, what the pagans always expected him to look like. He's the conquering, militant Jesus. And so his followers start to imitate that. And then we have bloodshed throughout church history. And it goes on till this day. It explains why, despite all the stuff in the New Testament about being humble and living this self-sacrificial lifestyle, despite all of that, many Christians have a militant view of God, a Caesar view of God, a sword-carrying view of God. It explains why many Christians spend much more time and are much more interested in passing laws against certain types of sinners than they are in serving other types of sinners. It's why many Christians deem other people's sins as worse than their own, even though Jesus explicitly tells us to do the opposite of that. See, we see what we want to see. We see what we expect to see, what we're conditioned to see, and we filter out everything else. That's why for many Christians, being right is more important than being loving. That's why for many Christians in America, they get very antsy, maybe even aggravated, if you question the righteousness and the God-favored status of America. Some maybe who are listening to this message right now are experiencing that. Because, see, we're heirs to this Constantinian paradigm, this way of looking at the church and at God and at Jesus. It's why many Christians get really livid when you start to question the appropriateness of Christians killing for God and country and the military. You see what we want to see. If we're not careful and to call into question maybe things that are obvious to us, well, then we're defined by our culture. It's very hard for fish to notice the water they swim in. It's hard for us to stay attentive to the air that we breathe. Unfortunately, in this fallen world, the water's polluted and the air's polluted. And if we're not consciously fighting against it, we're assimilating it, and it jaundices, it colors the way we look at the world, the way we look at God, the way we look at ourselves, the way we read the Bible.